Good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me loud and clear all the way in the back. So, as was just mentioned by Sandhya, thank you so much for that introduction. I will be going over what the format of our time this evening is going to look like. As was mentioned, we will be discussing India's economic relationship with China. However, I think what's going to be unique about today's discussion is that it's going to be performed in the Purva Paksha format. Now, what exactly is this format that we speak of? Essentially, the idea is to present the opposing viewpoint faithfully before presenting one's own view, and this is essentially what we would call Purva Paksha. It is an ancient Indian tradition of analytical debate and logic, and you may also have heard of it as the term steel manning. As you may have seen in today's event description, the aim is not really to win a debate, but rather to see clearly. Where did trust fray in the conversation? Where do interests align? Where could wisdom guide understanding? The traditional debate format, as we've come to know it, doesn't truly foster discussion. So, this evening, our hope is that you're not going to see two speakers take on an antagonistic or adversarial approach to debate, but rather, this is an attempt to engage in dialogue that's intended to heighten the quality of discourse and deepen mutual understanding about the topic at hand.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Pranay. Hope this is fun. Thank you so much for the introduction, Kripa. So, I have the rather enviable task of presenting this proposition. And the proposition is essentially that in today's world, India faces a stark choice between different orders of the future and different powers. And my argument is, and the proposition is, that India must lean towards China and work with China to counter the hegemony of the United States of America. I think you would assume that when I would begin this proposition, and I presume that when you've heard arguments of this nature outside this room, you probably would have heard arguments about pan-Asianism, the idea that these are both Asian powers that are rising together, and there are Western powers who are seeped in a history of colonialism. That is not my argument. Pan-Asianism or Asian romanticism is not my argument, and I don't think should be the proposition. Neither is my argument based in some mythical notion of two ancient civilizations that must dance together like the dragon and the elephant. That's not my argument, and that's not the basis of which I'm going to make this proposition. The argument from my perspective is premised on India's national or strategic interests. That's a realist view with which I'm going to argue that India must lean towards China and balance the United States by working with China. The argument is therefore based in the principle of Yogakshema, which is that India's interest should be the security and the prosperity of all Indians. And that's what should drive our foreign policy and strategic policy. This should be the basis on which we work with China. Now, if we take this as the base, and I want you to keep this in mind, I want to now take us around the world. So let's take a look at the world that we face, because with this interest that we have to seek, we have to first look at the world that we are living in. In the world that we are living in, firstly, China is a rising global power. It is an economic and industrial powerhouse. It is evidently investing in future industries. Just yesterday, there was a big document issued by the Chinese government which talked about 10 pioneering reforms on all factor markets, including land, labor, capital, with a specific focus on fostering future technology industries. They are engaging in the kind of reform that even the United States today wishes it was engaging in. China is a stable country. And we might take this lightly because constantly we hear stories about there being internal turmoil in China and Xi Jinping potentially being facing pushback. But China has proven that despite whatever political changes it has experienced over the last 45 years, it has been a stable country politically. Even after Tiananmen Square, it has been a stable country which has continued on the path of remarkable progress. It is also a power that is deeply concerned. Its primary concern is around the threat that it faces from potential containment and strangulation by the United States. So that is its primary concern. But that's a concern now for many countries. And increasingly, what you will see in surveys around the world is that China's popularity, because of its delivery of its system, because of its governance, and because of its stability, today outpaces American popularity. And Pew surveys show this also. But at the same time, this is a country that is clearly out to reshape the world order. It's trying to make changes in the world order, whether that is evident in supply chains, in issues of human rights, in terms of global governance. There is a range of initiatives that China has launched where it's trying to reshape the global order. For example, a global security initiative, which looks to undermine and break down ideas like collective security on which NATO is based. So it wants to make fundamental transformation changes in the world order. And a lot of these are driven by its own goals of growth and rejuvenation, but also because of anxiety with regard to American policy. That anxiety with regard to American policy is predominantly the factor which impacts China's engagement with India. Its concerns about India, and it has obviously demonstrated hostility towards India in the past 8 to 10 years. But a lot of that hostility continues in the context of its concerns around the US and India's engagement with the US. This is not to shift blame to say it is India's fault that China is hostile to India. This is to say that we must understand the thinking that drives some of this hostility from China. And a critical factor in that thinking is its perception of how India is playing a role in potentially undermining China's rise. So while yes, China has demonstrated hostility, my argument is that primarily this hostility is rooted in its concerns with regard to India's engagement with the United States. So China offers clearly some significant economic opportunities, and this is where it has. But it offers obviously certain threats. Now let's go across the Pacific and look at the United States. The United States today is a country which is in relative decline. And I mean that with all seriousness, relative decline, not in absolute decline. Militarily, the United States continues to be the incomparable global power. Nobody has the military reach that the United States has. And if you just look at the events of the last few months, or events even for the last couple of years, when the war in Gaza has been going on, when the war between Israel and Iran took place, the only country that could move assets or that could mobilize decisive force in some of those instances was the United States. China was deeply concerned, but it could not mobilize anything, and it did not. Economically, the United States, before I go to economics, on the military thing, yes, the United States has the capability to move these assets, but also over the last 25 years, the US has learned the limitations of the military instrument. It has not been able to decisively win any of its conflicts or achieve the kind of peace that it wanted to achieve, whether that was in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, or elsewhere. So, yes, it is an overwhelming military power, which is not compared to others, but it also has limitations. Economically, oh, 1 minute. Okay, so I'm nearly done. Okay, so economically, the US still remains incredibly dynamic. It leads in significant sectors around the world. And I'm not discounting any of these advantages in technology and economics that the US has. But the gap in these areas is being narrowed by China. Politically, however, the US is viciously polarized, which we can see just by the events of this week with the killing of Charlie Kirk. So the US of today or the US of tomorrow is not likely to be the US of yesterday. And that presents a very difficult choice for India when it comes to dealing with the United States. And we can see that in the last few months of our engagement with the United States. So, what should India do? What is in India's interest? Do you want to side with a cranky, aging hegemon who is lashing out and trying to reset the relationship with you with the express aim of trying to constrain your rise? Or do you want to lean towards an entity that has shown you hostility and who might be concerned about your rise, but the differential with whom, which is China, is far narrower than the differential with the United States, and the potential for that entity to deliver pain to you is far lesser than that of the United States. But that entity is your geographical neighbor, so the potential for him to create instability with you is far larger. So my argument in a nutshell is this: that while there are significant advantages of working with the US, given the current environment that we are in and the foreseeable future that we are likely to see, and given the structural changes in China's rise, it would be far more beneficial for India to lean towards China rather than to make it a permanently hostile neighbor with whom you have to live with and who's a major power, whose primary concern with regard to you is not necessarily your growing capability, your prosperity, but what you do with that prosperity with its adversary to try and contain it. Thank you.
Who I'm inviting to continue on with the refutation. Thank you, Pranay.
Okay. Namaskara. Dacha hao. Wanshang hao manot shanshang. And we are going to. Actually, Manoj has a tougher job here because he's talking about something new. Status quo is always comforting, new ideas are always challenging. So, he's given us a lot to think about. So, let me make the case that he made in my words and reaffirm some of the points that Manoj made. So, broadly, there are 5 points in my view. One, he talked about the idea of Yogakshema, which is peaceful enjoyment of prosperity, and that should be the lens through which we should observe anything related to foreign policy. So, and from that lens, we have to observe whether a relationship with one country or the other leads to benefits to Indian citizens or not. That should be the parameter. The second one is Manoj mentioned that China is a stable country. By some estimates, its popularity is also growing. And he said a very important point that its main concern with respect to India is the US. And it is the US which it is challenging. So why should we come in the way? And as long as uh, China thinks of India as maybe China thinks of India as US's junior partner. So why should we be in that situation? And as long as we can move away from that, there are benefits to be had between India and China, mutual benefits. The third point he made is, and I will sort of add my own color to it, just like China underwent a cultural revolution, probably the US is undergoing a cultural revolution of its own. And that can have very dramatic consequences. We don't even know how that will play out. And at least the way it is going, it doesn't look pretty for India or Indians. The fourth point he made is that our leverage with China is more than our leverage with the US, because US power differential with respect to India is huge, and the power differential between India and China is not as much. So probably China can inflict less pain, and that's the benefit to be had. The fifth point was that on some areas probably, and this is my addition to your argument, Manoj, that on some areas probably India China interests also align. So for example, on technology, say open technology, China is more forthcoming on that than US is. On And then even on trade, you can call it open trade with Chinese characteristics, but it is still open, more open than what the US is talking about now. So in that sense, India China interests also align, which is different. And final point is that US India relationship, we have seen, do have an upper bound. It's not as if all things will go in the same direction and we will be in this happy, mutually beneficial relationship. There is an upper limit. There is also a lower limit. I don't think it will go too badly, but there is also an upper limit. So we have to be aware of. So these were your points. Now let me argue exactly the opposite. I think many of those points probably need to be challenged. So I will give 5 points which I think will offer the other perspective. Now, with respect to China, the see geography is not destiny, but it is definitely an important determinant. And India, China have a structural problem. We have an economy which is 5 times larger than us in the immediate neighborhood. We have an active border conflict that can be dialed up and down by China whenever it wants. So even though we want to do a lot of things, they can suddenly do things on the border, which can again throw spanner in the works. Look at the Chinese perspective, right? So we have to also look from their perspective. Now, Chinese perspective, the idea is about Tianxia, which is everything under the heaven. The idea is that it wants tributary states around it. So countries in ASEAN region are fine, smaller, but India can't be a tributary. It won't be a tributary neither to the US or to China. So in that sense, from China's perspective, India is not an ideal partner, not the partner it wants. Then the alliance would make India a junior partner by default, even in the case of China, right? Because China's economy is 5x larger. So equal partnership in this relationship is structurally impossible. On the other hand, US is a faraway power. It has its problem. But in the Arthashastra tradition, we can think of China as the Ari, which is the enemy, right, to the Vijigishu in the center. But and US is the Udasina, which is the faraway power. So it has influence in this area, but not to the extent that it is an Ari or the adversary in the Arthashastra context. So this is my first point. Second point is been there, done that. So to expect that India will get any more favorable position today than what has happened in the last 10 years, to me, feels like wishful thinking, because the most, like, look at what has happened in the last 10 years, right? China refused India's entry into the nuclear suppliers group, even though both India and US tried for it. India also made an outreach towards the Chinese for this, but they didn't allow. Doklam happened, Galwan happened. All those things suggest that the situation is different. In fact, the PM has never mentioned China despite all the conflict. So clearly, even the border issue was, India tried to calm it down. There has been no provocation from the Indian side in the public statement, even in the statements that have been made by the government. But still, China hasn't shown any inclination towards India despite all these things. So find it difficult to see how China's position will change despite what India has done in the last 10 years. Third point, on the economy, China is not a partner but a gatekeeper. Now, that is because India's manufacturing interests are not in China's interests. We want to do more things with China, and we think we can do to China what China did to the US. That we will invite Chinese companies, we will learn the technology from them, and we will start doing the same things. But China already knows that it's played that game before. So why will it allow those things to happen? For example, in the last few years, you see specialty fertilizer exports to India have remained restricted. Foxconn employees have been recalled by Chinese engineers. Even German companies making tunnel boring machines in China have been prevented to sell into India. And there are many such instances which I will not go about, but they prove the point that it is, we want to do more things, but it is difficult for me to imagine that China will be able to give us the things that we want. And if we think of technology transfer, China Pakistan nexus exists. I don't think Pakistan has got any tech transfer from China on the civilian side, which they can say has improved their economy. So these actions suggest that China is clutching at the straws. It doesn't want industrial capacity to go out, and that will, so the benefits that we can have on the economic side are lesser. Fourth point is the two front problem. We know the again, China can do a lot more with Pakistan. There will be defense deals which will keep happening, and imagine if we are outraged by what US does with Pakistan in the past, but what China does with Pakistan on the military side is far more higher, and it will keep happening. So that's a big issue. And my final point is that revealed preferences matter more than stated preferences. So yeah, Trump says a lot of things, but just look at what has happened in the last few years. India's exports to the US are more than the exports of all BRICS countries combined. So if you don't get the US market, you can't substitute them by exporting into China. Anyways, China won't allow things to come in very easily. So that is a problem. Secondly, so we have to act tough with respect to the US, but finally we have to glide towards a pathway which allows India and US to work together. That's far more important than the China relationship. And look at what has happened in the last 2 months also. Despite all the things happening, NASA and ISRO launched the synthetic aperture radar mission, NISAR. That was launched. India and US militaries were in Alaska last week, joint military exercises. So all those things are continuing, Indus-X. So the level of partnership is very high, very important, and that it is important to work on that, even if it is not ideal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pranay. An invitation to Manoj for the counter response.
Thank you so much, Pranay. So I agree with a lot of what you've said, paradoxically. And let me begin with one of your earlier points where you started with the idea of, that India will be a junior partner with China, and that India needs to build its own power and capacity. I do think, yes, that the US remains important for India to build its own power and capacity. The trade data that you cited is, I think, incredibly important to that. Yes, the US is India's largest trade partner. It is a country that's also opened doors for India, right? It's not just in terms of trade, but if you look over the last 25 years, it is the US which has facilitated India's rise to the global high table, whether it was through the whether it was supporting India in the UN Security Council seat, whether it is India's entry to the NSG, whether it was normalizing India's nuclear trade with regard to India. So the US has played a significant role in that. The US has also played a significant role in terms of its technology ecosystem with which India is deeply connected, and that has benefited not the state necessarily, to some extent the state, but the people of India. And this city is obviously a testament to that. So I don't think that there is any two ways to that. And indeed, of course, I cannot compare that engagement with our technology engagement with China at all. Right? There is really no comparison. So indeed, I agree that yes, that the US actually brings much more to us in terms of economic and technologically and development opportunities in that regard. In addition, I agree with you that when you cited the trade data with regard to the BRICS countries, and if India has to in future become a bigger exporting power, particularly of merchandise goods, manufactured goods, the demand for that is likely to come from the West. China is not going to be your demand sink, even if the relationship becomes excellent. In fact, China is struggling to consume its own production. So where will it consume Indian production, right? And if you look at trade data, Chinese imports have been extremely weak and sustained. Even if they've grown at very marginal levels, and they've been mostly primary products from the developing world. So from an Indian point of view, that will also be largely the case. So yeah, so if you need the demand to grow, you will need Western demand. I also think that the argument that you made about whether China will want to export industrial capacity to India is a really strong argument, and I concur with you. In fact, I mean, you know as well as I do that the incredible amounts of Chinese narrative that I read, there has been over the last 5 years a very strong argument from Chinese strategists that look, we should not be exporting industrial capacity to India. India is a potential manufacturing enemy who will scuttle our growth in the future, and therefore we must constrain it. And therefore, what we've seen, and like you said, revealed actions, it tells you that they've exported that capacity to Southeast Asia and to other parts of the world, but not to India. So yeah, and there is concern in Beijing that if India grows, yes, it may benefit our companies, but that wealth growth is also it's fungible. You can use it for security and other purposes, so it can undermine us, particularly if India is close to the United States. So I concur with that also. I think that is a very important point. And finally, the Pakistan question that you raised, I agree. China's relationship with Pakistan has remained steady despite India, at different points of time having a normalized relationship with China. It's been steady. China has always kept that Pakistan card alive with regard to India, and it's no coincidence that the China-Pakistan relationship deepened after the 1962 war. That was not a coincidence. So I agree that Pakistan will remain a problem, and I also agree with you that China has treated Pakistan quite badly in some times. Right? It's been a dog that is willingly whipped when it's wanted to, whether it's through the FATF or other means. So if you become China's junior partner, yeah, it's not the happiest place in the world to be. So I concur with all of those, and I hope I've contributed to those also. That said, my pushback against some of those arguments is firstly, the relationship that we are talking about that India will have with either of those countries, China or the United States, will be one of junior partner. So the question is that which junior partner do you want to be? An entity that is far away, that is mercurial, and that is increasingly telling you that it no longer cares about the security interests of its allies and partners. And it would rather take care of its mercantilist business interests, and the security of yours is your problem. An entity that is potentially willing to jettison your core interests till it serves its transient short-term gains. An entity who might end up creating a rivalry between you and your biggest neighbor, complicating your entire continental security while it washes its hands away, just like it seemingly seems to be looking to say that to countries in East Asia and Taiwan. So yes, geography may not be destiny, but sometimes it has a greater say than anything else. So I would say that locking ourselves into that rivalry at the behest of becoming a junior partner of an unreliable entity might not be the best idea. Second, I agree, like I said, that Pakistan will remain a problem. But what we need to understand, and I think you pointed this out in your argument, and I further supported it, that China has also been mean to Pakistan at different points of time. It's not taking care of Pakistan's interests, which tells you that the relationship has complexities and has limitations and has ceilings. Now, Pakistan is a client state. It is an extremely promiscuous client, which seeks many patrons. And at present, it has three major patrons: China, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. If you want to deal with the client, because the client is our problem, we need to deal with the patron. You cannot not engage with the patron or have a close relationship. So the possibility of us having a far deeper relationship with China potentially makes it easier for us to deal with Pakistan, because the incentive for China to use the Pakistan stick potentially goes away. So that's something that we need to consider in terms of our engagement with China going forward and where we lean. So if we support them on some of their core interests, maybe we'll also get some degree of support. Third, I agree, we've not seen a great deal coming from China from an economic perspective, and I again supported that. But the fact is that, look, there are structural dynamics which are changing, right? The Chinese economy is a supply side economy, it's a manufacturing economy where demand is very, very low and they're dependent on external demand. India can provide that external demand today, and they would want their companies to continue producing because that's what churns that economy. So they want their companies to relocate. So while they may geopolitically have a problem with this, if your political relationship is better, it makes it much more feasible for them to export that capacity, because at the end of the day, Chinese might also relies on economic growth. Till they are economically strong, they are powerful. And I think they understand. So there is a confluence of factors, from weakening external demand from the West to India potentially being a demand sink for Chinese goods, that may lead to greater opportunities coming our way economically, which may have not come today. And frankly, historically, China has not been this country that has been able to export demand. It is today that it is in this place. Last year, China's total foreign ODI, outward direct investment, was $192 billion. Now, one may argue a significant percentage of that was loans, but that's a substantial amount of money going out of that country. And it is today a net exporter of capital, whereas the West and the US wants to attract capital for the American industrial base, and Europeans want to attract it for the European industrial base. So they're less likely to invest in our industrial base. So the money is going to come, is likely to come from the Chinese. My final point, and then I will stop, is on this idea of been there, done that. You'll not get a better deal. We've done this in the past, and we've seen this story before. And I can see where that comes from, and it makes a lot of sense also. But in international relations is not law. Precedent is not necessarily something that continues. We see that in our relationship with the United States. We went through a very difficult historical relationship, and then nearly 27 years of really deep bonhomie to this sudden cracks that we have seen, which have been brewing for some time. In some ways, yes, interests are permanent, but partners can change, right? It's again a very promiscuous domain. So I would argue that today, because we have this proximity with China, we have with the United States, we have a leverage to negotiate with China better. Tomorrow, that leverage will not remain, because our relationship with the US will weaken to this extent that we are not able to even negotiate that with the Chinese. So this is a window of opportunity that we have right now to actually go closer, negotiate with the leverage that we still have a close relationship with the United States, rather than wait for that leverage to, whittle away and then come to a point where you are unable to negotiate with either. So to me, you are probably likely to get a better deal right now, because the Chinese interest and anxiety is far heightened, and you have far greater leverage than you have had at any other time in the past. So therefore, I would argue that this is an opportune moment to do so. Thanks.
First of all, I wanted to say that perhaps we in India have a deeply ingrained distrust of the West because of our colonial experience, historical colonial experience. But having said that, that colonialism is firmly in the rearview mirror. It's in the past. Today, we are dealing with two powers: one status quo power, the United States, and the other rising power, China. And there is one very big difference between the two countries that, as far as I can tell, hasn't come up in the discussions. The openness of their societies, the relative openness of their societies. In the case of the US, it is an open society, as we are an open society in India. It is quite easy for us to find out who are the key advisors of the president, what are the different segments of opinion in the US, both at government level, senator level, congressional level, about public opinion and governmental opinion in the US, whereas China is completely opaque. Who are Xi Jinping's key advisors? What is Chinese public opinion about any given issue? It's very difficult for us to find out that, whereas they can find out those things about us very easily. So, isn't that a good reason to align much more closely with the US than with China?
Thank you so much. And we'll take a question in the front here.
What Xi Jinping's people
That's
are
right. I'm
doing
very,
on a
very
daily
keen
basis.
to hear actually what Manoj has to say. Go ahead, sir. Yeah.
Yeah. This is a thing that is probably the most difficult to accept within India from different parts of the political spectrum. Why don't we go back to the border question of that appeared to be almost settled in the 50s? Why do we want to stick to colonial borders that were arbitrarily drawn with thick red pens? One other thing, and this is with respect to BYD, why don't we allow investments like BYD into India? What harm does that do to us?
Thank you for your question, sir. And then I'm going to just invite the person in the right corner over there. The gentleman in the corner in the back. Thank you.
Thank you. My question is about security because whatever said and done, there is an active threat from China when it comes to border security. And we've had incursions quite recently. So are we dissociating that from the larger argument? And are we basing our view of reducing our relationship with US simply on the immediate impact of the Trump years rather than the long-term impact of US-India relations?
Thank you so much for your question. And sorry, I didn't quite see your hand there, but I'll
Can we
turn
take
over to
this?
us.
Yeah. So to the first question, very briefly, China is opaque at certain levels, but there is, if you want to find out, there is a lot that you can find out. Sometimes there is so much information that the challenge is not the information, the challenge is signal to noise ratio. So there is a lot of information that you can find with regard to China. I recommend reading my newsletter. It's daily. And I recommend my colleague Anushka's newsletter also. That's weekly, so less burden. But there's a lot that is available that you can track, and you can understand trend lines. Look, all politics at elite levels tend to become quite opaque. Why Donald Trump does certain things is very difficult to figure out. Sometimes they seem to be even antithetical to American strategic interests. So I wouldn't place lack of understanding as a reason for not being deeply aligned. I would say that we must enhance our understanding. And there is a lot that one can do to enhance understanding in that extent. So I wouldn't say that as a determinant alone to make that decision on China's system. There is a lot that we can learn about the system and how it operates and who advisors are and what they do and how they do. It's just that it's not as easy as looking at other countries. There was another question on the border security, right? So I don't think the argument is that we should be disregarding the border security or the border issue. I think the argument is that if you need to resolve the border issue, you need to engage with China. Nobody else is going to resolve your border issue for you. So we need to engage with China. And to do that, you need to build a certain degree of trust to be able to engage with China. And to build trust, you need to be able to have some degree of conversation around interests of each other and respecting each other's interests. The challenge is that we are today negotiating from a position of weakness. Because structurally, yes, we are in a position of weakness, whether it's with regard to the US or China. Does that mean that we must settle the border issue willy-nilly? No, but at the end of the day, all border settlements require some compromise. But to arrive at that compromise, you will have to engage. So this is not necessarily on the part of the debate, but just with regard to dealing with any country, you will have to talk to a country who's your adversary. You cannot go into this mode of today I am annoyed, so I will not talk to you for 3 years. And then the 4th year, I will assume that we will start talking again. And I'll assume that there will be forward movement. You can do that if you have tremendous amounts of sticks in your hand that you can beat them with, which unfortunately we don't.
So, a couple of points. I'll address the BYD question and the openness question. So, first on the openness, see, openness is perhaps just one of the parameters, definitely not the most important parameter. Finally, it's interests that matter. US works with a lot of countries which are opaque. And it has been working for a long time. So, that is one point. And there are other issues also, right? Like he said that we don't know what's happening in the Trump administration, for example. So, even, for example, there's a big difference between a presidential system and a parliamentary system. Sometimes we don't even understand, that becomes a problem. So though it's not necessarily that open societies translate into better relationships. There are many other factors involved. The second bit is openness cannot be taken for guaranteed with what is happening in the US. Like I said, it's probably undergoing a cultural revolution on many counts. So we don't know what it will pan out to. The third point on this is if you look broadly, any relationship has three parameters. One is the people to people relationship, where probably openness is a positive in the India US thing. Then there is a state to state relationship, that is the two nation state governments talking to each other. And the third is how Indian people perceive the American state and how the American people perceive Indian state. All these three parameters count. State to state relationship has improved, but now it is getting into rough territory. People to people relationships were always good, but the third parameter is still the weakest link. Indian, as you said, right? The way we perceive the US state is negative, and it will become more so because of what the US has done. Similarly, on the other side, so that sets the upper ceiling to what can happen between the two countries. That's my answer to that. BYD question, I agree. I think BYD we should be open to, but there are two parameters here. First of all, I mean, I have written even on chips, we should be open to low end chips are not a security threat. We should be open to recoupling in certain selective domains, not anything related to things which affect our cognitive autonomy. So, nothing on social media, nothing on defense, but other areas as a broad area, EVs might be a way where we want to. But there is another side to it. One news reportage is that we have not allowed them, but there is also equally reportage on the Chinese media side that they are not willing to sell it. Yeah. So we only read the Indian news that we have allowed, sometimes we have not allowed, sometimes we are going to allow. But if you read the Chinese media, there is a lot of sense that why is BYD going there? We should not allow BYD to go there. So we have to be realistic about what they are willing to do.
And I think we have time for two more questions in this segment. I know the gentleman over here in the front had a question, and then I see there's someone over here in a blue shirt, if you don't mind. Yeah, so we'll take both of these
Thanks.
questions. Thank you.
Audible? Yeah. So first of all, thanks for excellent points. I'll try to be very, very brief. I've got 2 points. Number one, and some of that was, I think, addressed by Pranay, but not so clear. Any geopolitical or geostrategic relationship is really based on a substratum of a people-to-people social, cultural relationship. And if you look at that, and if you for a moment ignore centuries-old Buddhism and Xian Chang or whatever that name, the relationship between India and US is far stronger at a people-to-people social cultural level than the other side. That's number one. Number two is I think both of you are taking a snapshot view of the situation. If you look at the trend, instead of looking at 2025, if you look at the trend and say 2030 or 2035, and all these are long-term issues, right? It's no longer a situation of little adolescent boy or girl looking at two big adults and trying to see how to deal with them. I think the adolescent boy or girl is growing up very fast. And the gap that you talked about is going to close very fast, whether in economic terms or in defense terms or in strategic strength and so on and so forth. So if you look at it in that respect and see what we should do in, let's say, 2035, why can't we look at being a pole ourselves rather than aligning to this or that? That is
Thank you, sir, for your comments. There was a question here in the front, and I am going to invite, there was a gentleman in the back in the blue shirt who didn't get a chance to ask his question as well. Yeah.
Hello. So we see that China is deepening engagement in certain multilateral institutions such as BRICS and SCO, and while it's also calming its bilateral ties. So can these forums be seen as instruments of stabilizing relations with India, or do they merely serve the purpose of signaling? Right.
Thank you. And then one last question from the back over there, and then we'll turn to our speakers to respond.
Thank you very much. And sorry for interrupting earlier. I hadn't realized that I wasn't the first speaker. Both of you make the assumption that China is a stable entity, and yet its demographics are such that it's rapidly aging. do you assume that China will continue on its current path, or do you feel it will be as other, like Western Europe and Japan, that becoming an Asian society will make it less economically viable and less powerful in the future, and therefore less useful as a partner of India?
Thank you. So over to our speakers. Mull on and then respond.
Yeah, so on the first question with regard to, people to people connection, I agree. I think the fact that India and China's relationship at a people to people level is so poor is partly because the relationship is very top heavy and it has always been politically top heavy. If you go back to pre COVID and even pre Doklam, you will see that there was a organic growth in that happening as Chinese investments were coming into India, Indian students were traveling to China. We had some 20 odd thousand students in China when COVID hit. So that aspect was growing. Now, whether India remained attractive to Chinese people, not necessarily, because this is a newly wealthy Chinese uh, population which is looking at the West when they're looking for their holidays and travels and shopping. They want to buy electronics from Japan and they want to go to Harrods, which is very alike our newly wealthy people, right? So that's not something surprising. If we allow, and currently we over the last 5 years, structurally that bond has not been allowed to grow. We don't have direct flights. So if you allow that bond to grow, and if the if the relationship at a political level remains stable, my understanding is that the bond will grow, because there is far greater attraction today for China among Indians than there has been in the past. On the flip side, if you see, the West seems to be closing in on itself. So that would make the attraction of China perhaps far greater. But I'm not saying that it will become like the Indian relationship with the United States. There's no equivalent. I grew up in the 1990s. There's no equivalent of friends that China produces which can influence people. So I agree with that to some extent. Although there was Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. So there is that piece. On the issue of the long term that we are thinking, I think none of us is arguing that India need not have the ambition of being a pole. Whether you are a pole or not is a function of your power and your capability. Our argument is that the pathway towards that power and capability in the world that we see for the next 5 to 10 years at the minimum, given what the United States is going through, is one where my argument is that, not ours. My argument is that you will have to lean towards the Chinese, because the United States is not going to be the United States of the past. This is not a transient phase. This is not one crazy man in power. This is a structural shift in American society that's taking place, which is going to be challenging. And Pranay categorized it well when he called it a cultural evolution. So a pathway to that power is by alignment with somebody like China today. Just like in the 1970s, China's pathway to power was alignment with the United States. So that does not mean you give up your ambitions to be a pole. So that was my thought on that. There was another question on SEO and BRICS, right? So to me, these are instruments which have been the biggest success of the SEO and the BRICS is branding, right? They have not achieved anything substantive, path-breaking, but they have become brand values that the West is increasingly anxious about. Whenever I talk to Western journalists, whether that's in Germany, whether it's in the US, whether it's in the UK, they are deeply anxious when one of these meetings are happening. But like the SEO meeting happened recently. But most of the journalists that I was talking to did not even know what the SEO was, but they were anxious about it. So there is a certain brand value that they have achieved because of just the convening power that they have achieved. Beyond that, substantively, I don't think they are in a position right now that they challenge, say, American dominance. But these are building blocks. These are building blocks that China is building to try and create other capabilities, to try and create alternate pathways for, say, trade, for, say, security cooperation with other countries. So to their effectiveness today is very limited. And the gentleman backstage had a question on whether China is a stable. Our assumption is that China is a stable country. Look, and there was also an argument that the differential will be bridged very soon. No, not at current growth rates of India and current growth rates of China. The differential is not going to be bridged very soon. It won't be even substantively bridged. Power obviously is relative. In different dimensions, power has different functions. So the military differential, I don't think, is as substantive today on the border. You can hold off. But in other domains, over the next 5 years, I mean, you'll see Chinese aircraft carriers in the Indian Ocean. You will see the pace at which China is building 5th generation fighter jets. You're going to see the differential increase, even economically and militarily. So on the point of whether China is stable, I think demography is a problem, but what you can see is that the leadership seems to be seized of that problem. It is a problem, no denying. And you can see steps being taken. You can see also steps being taken to try and find ways where you can remain closed but open. So to try and create separate islands for talent, which is international, which can come in and which can settle. So I think I would not bet against Chinese adaptability, right? Let me put it that way. It may hit growth, it may it may create challenges, but I would not bet against Chinese adaptability. Lots of people have made a living by predicting China's collapse. But what we have seen over the past 50 years is that China has managed to adapt, and the Communist Party has managed to adapt. So as much as I would hate to agree, I think that yes, they have shown adaptability.
Pranay, to add before our
Yeah,
next segment.
couple of points. Yeah, SEO and BRICS are probably building blocks. That's why the name BRICS. But I think generally, other than that, I agree that not much beyond the nuisance value that it serves. That is an important value. Nuisance is an important function. But other than that, I have been to a few BRICS forums, and there's not much happening at all. Let me put it that way. So I would say, yeah, that's the purpose of it. Now, coming to 2 points. One on the multipolarity bit. See, we all like to be, we would like to be multipolar, is the Indian government's position. But a lot of people will say today's world is moving towards bipolarity, where there is US and China being more powerful. So, yeah, we would want to do that. And absolutely agree. Finally, we have to become a pole. But that will take time, right? So, we are talking about the pathway. The Viksit Bharat vision is a good one. There's a target 2047 developed country, $11,500 per capita income. It's a great goal to achieve. So, right. So, if, at least then we can be a power which other countries want to do, right? We have to be able to inflict costs on other countries and also bestow benefits to other countries so that you can have a bigger sphere. Right now, we are not in a position to inflict a lot of costs. That's why for something in Russia, US has charged some tariffs on us, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. So yeah, we want to be a pole, and we are just talking about how do we get there. The second point, and I just want to address the question on what is the future of China and some trends on that, right? A few things. One thing we know is the CPC has shown remarkable flexibility in the way it has operated. It learned from what happened with the Soviet Union and it changed stance. The bureaucratic decentralization in China is much more than in India. 51% of spending happens at sub-provincial levels in China. In India, it is 3%. So they have done a lot of things which are they're flexible, right? 18,000 foreign professors were there in China before COVID. I don't think that many we have, not even 1/10 of it, right? So those things indicate to me that they will probably, the trajectory is down on some counts, but I don't think it is like collapse in that sense. It will still have substantial economic power and it will remain a pole. It looks like.
Thank you so much, Pranay. So with that, we actually will conclude this segment of audience questions. Like we alluded to earlier, there'll be an opportunity to ask a few more questions. So to give Pranay a bit of a break, because he was our last speaker, I'm going to turn to Manoj for the next segment, which essentially is the evidence discussion, where here's an opportunity to talk about what evidence would change your mind possibly. And the hope here is that you're going to explicitly state what your falsifiability criteria is. Over to you, Manoj. Thank you.
So this is the hard part, right? You build a case and now you're being asked to break it. So so there are, I mean, obviously some of the points, like I said, I agree with a lot of the things that Pranay has said, and obviously the view at the end of the day has to always be much more nuanced when you're thinking about something as complex as this balance which needs to be achieved. If it was so simple, the foreign minister would be having much more peaceful days. I think there are a few, 5 or 6 points that I would like to make to argue that if these events were to evolve in this direction, and if this is what was the outcome that I would start seeing in terms of evidence playing out in the world, then I would say that yes, India needs to not necessarily tilt and lean and, much more closely towards China. The first point is that if the American domestic turmoil were to settle, I'm not saying that America goes back to the way it was. It will not. I mean, unfortunate for the people who didn't grow up in the 1990s. It was a much nicer America in some ways, at least for India, late 1990s onwards. But if the American domestic turmoil is to settle towards some sort of a new equilibrium that at least moves away from what we see today as this intense extractive nihilism towards the world, where you want to, I mean, somebody had said that America is a status quo power. It's not a status quo power today. It's been a revisionist power, but today it seems like it wants to be a revolutionary power. It wants to break what it had built. But if it moves away from that towards some sort of a new model, even if that new model means that 10% of tariff is the new zero in the world, if you even move to that, saying that we will have fundamentally looking for shared prosperity with trusted partners as our goal, and strategic competition with China, because we don't necessarily want China as the Chinese model of opacity, of one party rule. We don't want that, and there's a lack of freedom at a political level in a society to become the model for the world. That we will provide a model for modernization. I think I would start to shift, because to me that is a far more preferential model than something which is relatively closed compared to the United States, but also not necessarily as beneficial to citizens in terms of how they engage with the state and the polity. So in terms of individual liberty. The second thing that I would say is that if the China-Pakistan relationship were to move away from this current state of proximity to formal alliance, we forget that India has had, we had Operation Sindoor recently, but in 1999 we had the Kargil War. In 1965 we had a conflict with Pakistan. In neither of these conflicts, China intervened. Right? Even in 1971, China didn't intervene. It signaled a lot of things, but it didn't intervene. But if that was to fundamentally change, that we see an alliance, that an attack on you is an attack on me, I would say that that's a deal breaker. Third, if there is a border compromise is not a deal breaker for me. All borders end with compromises, as hard as it might be. But if Beijing were to start acquiring basing rights around India, for the PLA Navy to have permanent bases around India, to me that would be deeply problematic, and that would be deeply inimical to India's interests. If the string of pearls proverbial one were to be actually built, to me that would be a deal breaker. If I start seeing that happening. So far we are not seeing Beijing have basing rights. Of course, if there is a conflict on the border, then you can't necessarily have a relationship where you lean towards China if you're fighting on the border. So if you have conflict on the border, if the Chinese initiate a conflict and that goes on, then yes, of course, that's not going to work out. Another interesting point is that if the US-China relationship were to deteriorate into a Cold War, a proper Cold War with two blocks, as hard as those blocks can be, or as soft as even those blocks can be, as somewhat porous they can be, but if it breaks into two blocks where this ecosystem split, I would say we should not be leaning towards China. But I would also say we should not be leaning towards the United States. We should not be joining an American bloc. I would say that that's the time to go back to Old Faithful, which is non-alignment. Because you don't want to become a frontline state in a Cold War. It didn't turn out well for Pakistan. The Pakistani Field Marshal calls the state a dumpster, right? So you don't want to be there. Finally, what the gentleman had asked, if the Chinese economy were to stumble to the extent that it can no longer fund India's industrialization, that all it wants from India is to buy goods manufactured in China and not invest in India, not do anything with regard to the Indian economy growing, then I would say, okay, I'll still trade with you because your exports, the imports that I get from China are useful in terms of boosting Indian exports, but you're not providing me the game changer that I need. And you're structurally denying me that, then why should I lean towards you when it comes to your strategic competition with the United States? It's not in my interest. It's then in my interest to continue down this muddled path of multi-alignment because that works for me. So if those circumstances were to evolve and that's the evidence that we start seeing going down the road, I would probably change my view.
Thank you, Manoj. Please take a seat. Pranay, I'll just invite you to discuss again the evidence that you think would change your mind.
Yeah, so I made the case for why India should still continue to have a closer relationship with the US despite all the things that are happening. And these are 5 points which will make me reconsider my view. and they are in decreasing order of likelihood. So first thing is, if the US India deal doesn't happen, issues escalate further, there is probably an outsourcing tax, as it has been talked about. There are attacks on Indians like it happened yesterday. All those things, if they continue, they are going to make these things much more difficult. And we are in a global information ecosystem. That's where the connections with the US actually will become a problem, because our reference network is there, and you will see a lot of things happening on a daily basis that will set a lot of things in motion, and it will be difficult for India US relationship to go further. So that is one point, and probably very it is there is a definitely higher likelihood than the other points that I'm saying. The second one is, if China's growth model changes to involve, so right now China doesn't have an over investment problem, it has an over capacity problem, which is it is always wanting to export others. That's how its investment led model operates: produce a lot more, overproduce, sell to the world, and that chugs the economy along. Now Manoj made the point that probably that situation is changing. I'm not sure. If we are seeing those changes, then at least, for example, some of the things that China is doing to block Foxconn engineers or others wouldn't have happened. But if that changes, then there is benefits to be had. Like I have argued that there is benefits from investment in certain areas. Especially, we are seeing that in solar photovoltaic cells or battery tech or low end chips. All that helps, and a lot of the exports that India is doing on electronics are because of Chinese imports. That's very clear data about that. Most of the things that we are adding value and selling is also based on what you are getting from China, right? So that thing matters. What we want is investment from there, and that can only happen if China is open to it, and it does a revision of its growth model, as Manoj said it probably wants. The third point is, if China Pakistan relations worsen, but because see, for the Pakistani state also, China is a patron state, but not the kind of patron state the others were, Saudi Arabia, US, because it gives a lot of loans. Loans are at high rates. That's not the ideal state, and you're seeing what the field marshal of Pakistan is trying to do, right? Go and meet Trump, and then also try to get deal on critical minerals in Balochistan. I mean, I don't know who's going to go there mining, but all those things are attempts to also woo US. So if US Pakistan relationships improve, probably there will be a change in China Pakistan relations, and there probably we have an opportunity to do more with China. Again, unlikely, but these are the things that I wanted to add. Fourth point: if US China relations improve dramatically, then it will be a big trouble. So if the US China relationship is stronger than the India China and the India US relationship, then we are in trouble. So I think that is one thing we need to keep in mind. But I think it is less likely, because US China is a structural rivalry, in spite of probably there might be some deal. So that's why I've put it. But even if a deal happens, I think the structural rivalry bit will continue. It's difficult for US to accept, or any current power to accept another power coming in. So that will continue. But if those factors change, then I would revise my view. And the final one is, if the border dispute is at least managed and sort of put to a back burner to the sort of understanding on both sides that this is not the biggest issue, then it is likely. But to me, it seems again very unlikely, because some things can always go wrong. There are people uh, which are on the border. That idea that things will not happen seems to be unlikely. We have seen repeated things happening, even though relationships improve, even though there is Xi Jinping coming to India, but then things again change. So Doklam, Galwan, all those things suggest to me that it is less likely. So these are 5 points. If there is change in it, probably I would change my view also. Thanks.
Thank you, Pranay. So I'm going to ask actually both our speakers to remain seated, because I'm just such a kind moderator and I care about them not expending too much energy after so long. So as you've followed along behind me, you know that we've reached the second round of audience questions, or the Sabha Prashne. As we did before, I'm just going to ask that you keep your questions brief, put your hand up, and then we'll call on you and you'll have an opportunity to ask your question. Yeah.
Wonderful session so far. We did touch upon whether whatever happening with the US is a transient or not, or it may remain. I feel even in US itself, there is a lot of argument against what is actually happening there, right? So there's a lot of unrest. I just wonder, are we trying to react too much to what is going on, or isn't it really going? Is it really going to be that long lasting, or probably with all the disturbances which are going around in terms of tariff and all, once it reverses the equation, there might be, and I just want to pick your mind on, there might be a greater respect from US to India, saying India is a very strong partner for us. We can't live without it. What is your take on that?
Thank you, sir. And so then the gentleman in the back in the green t-shirt.
Hi. So, like we are saying that both the options we're not liking, US is unreliable in the short term, China is permanently seems adversarial. Like based on the discussion we had till now, it seemed to me, doesn't it make more sense rather than we break our heads trying to think, should we go with the US way or China? We try to find a set of other countries and then align with them. So, kind of creating a third block of other countries. So, for example, with Pakistan, we said that Pakistan relies on US and China, but there's also Saudi. So, in a lot of issues that concern us, we could have a coalition of other countries which can act as the counter pressure force against both US and China, and we can play them rather than wondering if we, and this would be more decentralized decision making as well. So, rather than please one president or one premier, we can build a coalition. How about that as a strategy?
Thank you. And then the last question for this section too.
Hello, sir. My question was apart from border conflicts, trade, etc., what are the narrative issues that frame India China relations as of today?
Okay. Hi. Okay, it's one. Okay, so let me take the state of the US, whether it is a transient phase or whether it is something far more structural, and whether somewhat normalcy will return. So that was one of my conditions, right? That if that were to happen, I would want to sort of change my view. I'm increasing. My first thought is that I don't think the US is going to go back to the US that we knew, right? And that there are structural reasons for that. The Supreme Court's ruling on the powers of the president is one example. I think the way Congress has been undermined under this administration and the way Congress has gone along with everything that has been asked, the kind of gerrymandering that we are seeing in different states in the US today, where Texas wants to increase Republican seats because Trump has asked for them. In response, California is launching its own initiative to try and increase seats so that Democrats can get seats. So the nature of political discourse and political competition in the US is fundamentally different today than what it was. I don't know where it will end. I don't know where it will go. But there are structural signs that are telling you that it is not going to go back to where it was. Even when it comes to engaging with the world, I think this is not just Trump. I think there is a deep sense within the United States, or at least a large section of the US, that the US has been taken for a ride. It has been treated unfairly. And I think Trump has ridden that anger. And that anger is rooted in what is middle America losing its manufacturing jobs, losing old energy jobs, coal jobs, and things like that. So there is deep frustration with what was economic globalization, and that's not going to go away. Maybe some sanity will return once you realize that, look, you need to engage. And in the deals that they have struck, you can see that there is some pragmatism in terms of the nature of the deals that they have struck. But it's very different from what it was, and it's not going to go back to that. What it will be, I don't know. But my assumption is it will be much harsher than what it was. And it will be, and in some ways, there is a redefinition of how the US sees itself in the world, right? And there's also a redefinition taking place of what does it mean to be an American? Is America a nation of a creed that based on its sort of declaration of independence, or is America is an American to be defined from religious, ethnic, racial characteristics? And I think that's the argument, that's the sort of discourse in the United States today. And it's a difficult position to be in. It seems like a couple of 100-year-old argument which is being rehashed, which is something that I think we in India are quite familiar with because we've also been going through something like that, where a couple of 100-year-old debates are being rehashed. So therefore, I think that it will be difficult to get back to where we were. So yeah, that was the first thing. There was another question on the narrative of India and China, right? Look, I think that the narrative is fundamentally one which is in China. If you read how the Chinese think about India, um, my colleagues will talk about the fact that we have this paper that we've been trying to work on for many years now, which talks about 7 Chinese narratives on India. So there's a narrative of competition and adversarialness, which is rooted in history of the relationship, but also the idea that India is fundamentally a colonial outpost. Whether that in the past it was seen as the outpost of the Raj, today it is seen as an outpost of US power that coexists with the idea that India is this great civilization, but a great civilization that lost its way, and has never been able to fundamentally regain its authority. And that's because of internal fractures. There's a narrative of India being an opportunistic global actor, which plays everybody to try and get the best deal that it can, so therefore it can't be trusted as much. And then there's a narrative of India as an emerging economy, which we must work with, and it can be a regional partner. So all of these coexist. But what revealed policy tells you is that fundamentally India has been seen as an inferior power which exists in this region that is hindering China's rise, and to that extent, it is working with the United States. So that is a narrative that exists in China about India.
Yeah, so addressing all 3 questions. So first one, yeah, just like we say, never bet against India. People also say never bet against the US, right? Their history also shows that. So maybe there are checks and balances in that system. If you see, 1960s was a terrible time for the US in many ways, but it did come back from it, right? So yes, there are arguments that it can come back, and probably even if it doesn't, we should be prepared to work with a more authoritarian US. Probably that's the way the world is. We don't get to choose how the US is behaving. It is what it is, right? But what you can see is, even though if the deal happens, this issue is not going to go away. Just look at what has happened with South Korea, right? South Korea and US have a deal. All thing is okay. South Korea has said we'll invest $350 billion in the US, but then there is a raid on a factory, and then people are sent out, right? Those things can happen even after the deal, and those things will have an impact on India-US relationship also, right? Because so foreign policy and even negotiating is not a finite sum game. It is an infinite game where you will keep doing many moves, and with this, it a deal is not the end point. It is just one point where you can then talk to the next thing, and then if something happens on this migration and host of other issues which they are pulling out, things can again go awry. So that was my point on this. The Dipankar's point on other countries. See, the third countries, there is a lot of talk about coalition of middle powers, but middle powers come in many varieties. They have their own interests. So just because they are middle powers, they are not going to align. Just look at how most of the countries are reacting with respect to Trump, right? They are willing to give away a lot of things, concede to be in Trump's good books rather than think of a middle power coalition, right? So it is a good idea, but in international relations, good is seldom what happens, right? It is based on power, so it seems unlikely. And also the other powers which can move the needle are way too close to the US. So EU, for example, you would want to do more, so maybe the FTA happens will be useful, but still the revealed preference of the EU doesn't suggest that it wants to stand out as a power on its own. It is more comfortable to concede more to the US and be with it, right? And then yeah, there's Japan, there's Australia, other countries are there, and good that we are doing a lot with them, but still you will have to deal with the bigger power. So that was my point. The third one on the narratives, I'll just add one narrative. The major narrative from India side on the economic front is one of China will dump a lot of goods in India. That will lead to problems. So we should be wary of the economic relationship as well. That's like driving a lot of things on the economy as well. That our trade deficit with them is very high. It's a transactional economic buy-sell relationship rather than a partnership. So that drives a lot of things. That's
Thank you, Pranay. And with that, we'll conclude actually our audience question portion and move right into our final segment for this evening, which is the synthesis portion. And here, the objective is, as you may already see behind me, that each speaker is to acknowledge a compelling point from the other and see if there's opportunity to identify convergence within the argument. So with that, I'll turn to Manoj first to begin this concluding segment. Thank you.
So very briefly, to me, both these relationships are extremely important for India's future, right? It's and therefore, at the end of the day, if you are in a position where you have to choose one over the other, at the end of the day, it's not the best position to be in. So the approach of policy, therefore, has to be one where we are trying to, and this is what this debate tells me, right? That our goal has to be always to try and find a balance between these relationships, because at the end of the day, both of them are critical for our overall development and security. The question is, what's the kind of balance that you will strike? And the answer that this conversation seems to tell us is that it's constantly going to be evolving. It's not going to be a balance that you strike at a moment that will not shift. In today's world under Donald Trump, maybe in a week, but perhaps in a few months, in a year or 2 years, that balance will constantly be shifting. So it's a tough job to be able to strike that balance. That's the first point that I would like to make. That also, the corollary to that is that India must therefore figure out a way where it has to learn to swing between both these countries without picking sides. So we'll have to find a way to do that as much as we can. If I was to reflect on the conversation that we've had, and Pranay talked about the 3 parameters on which you look at a relationship, people to people, economics, and others. There are 4 factors that come to my mind: values, economic relationships, security, and people to people ties. And I think in each of these, India's relationship with the US is far stronger and far more important in some ways. It is highly unlikely that India and China will arrive at some sort of a security arrangement. You may agree on some sort of a management arrangement with regard to the boundary, but China's rising power, Edward Luttwak talked about this, right? If there are lots of entities in an elevator and an elephant steps into the elevator, everybody's space starts to squeeze. Now imagine if that elephant continues to grow larger. Even if the elephant is non-threatening, it will feel extremely problematic. And in some ways, that's where China is, right? So even if China was not to be threatening to us, just the fact that over the next few years, you will see more military equipment, more technology, more dominance, and more presence in our region will make it uncomfortable from an Indian point of view. So that's very difficult to arrive at that balance. Likewise, from a Chinese perspective, India is a elephant which is growing, right? India's engagement in China's periphery is also growing. So there are structural challenges in this relationship that are likely to make it very difficult to arrive at an equilibrium that sustains for a prolonged period of time. On issues of economics, I think both of our takeaways is that, yes, I think that there are complementarities, and not just on trade, on investment, but also on things like urbanization and learning from each other in terms of how do we manage urbanization better. I don't want the huko system in India, but at least to be able to ensure that you have better housing. How do you use idle stock land? What kind of mechanisms you can develop for financing, infrastructure development, given the roads that we have. So there is lots that we can collaborate on, even pollution. On people-to-people relationship, I agree. Our relationship with the US is stronger. It is going to remain stronger. People vote with their feet. And even though if you ease up with China also, I think the attraction of the West will be still substantial, relatively from a comparative point of view. The final point that I want to make is that, this is something which again goes against my proposition, which is that, and Pranay had argued this, that those who have sought accommodation with China have seldom been treated as equals. Even Russia, which China in its discourse and its diplomatic thinking treats as a major power. And there are only 3 major powers apart from China in the world in the Chinese diplomatic logic: the US, the EU, and Russia. India is not a major power. It has never been one. And it's unlikely to be one in the Chinese vision. So even Russia, which is treated as a major power and thereby some sort of an equal, is not treated as an equal. Is treated as an entity that does not have an easy time, right? China does not mind trampling on Russian shoes from time to time. Now imagine how it would treat India if India is anyway seen as an inferior power, and if India is seen as a power that is supplicating itself to try and sell off whatever interest it has with the US. So I think that it will be very difficult from an Indian point of view to try and shift our mental model and make the trade-offs that might be needed to be made to become closer to China. So as much as there may be interest and there may be an interest gain in that, it might be very difficult from a psychological point of view in India to do that. Would we want to concede on Tibet? And to what extent would we want to concede? Even though sometimes it may be in an interest. So some things sometimes go beyond interest, right? They hit identity also. So it can be very, very difficult to try and do that. In the process of dealing with China, the US remains our best bet, as difficult as that bet is. Because at the end of the day, if you need to deal with China, you need to deal with them from a position of strength. And if you're going to build that strength, the US demonstrably is our partner, given our defense relationship and our economic relationship with the US. So that's, I think, fundamental. The last point, and very briefly I'll conclude with this, is that what this debate also tells me is that from an Indian perspective, and this comes from the evidence that both of us argued about in the end, a certain amount of friction between China and the United States is in our interest. So maybe if we can find ways to facilitate that friction, that might be useful to keep alive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manoj. I'll invite Pranay, please.
Okay, so I will make 4 points related to this. So first is related to this idea of swing power. Nitin had written about it a long time ago. Swing power is defined as a nation state which has enough weight such that on whichever side it places its weight on, that side wins, right? So it is a consequential power, right? That's the idea of swing power. But what we are seeing is that in the last few years we have been a swung power than a swing power. So we have to change that strategy. So ideally, we have to grow our own power, become and use whatever partners we can get to quickly reach that point where other nation states don't take India for granted, right? So that's really the main idea. I think all of us will agree. But it's important that we get there quickly rather than slowly. And there are lots of things we can do to achieve that faster. So the good thing is, because of this turmoil, there is a conversation about what are the things we can do differently. Is there a 1991 kind of moment? At least those conversations and things which are happening because of that are really important. They are more consequential than probably what happens between US China. That is the most consequential. So that's my first point. Second, Manoj used the word balance. I just wanted to caveat that, like what he said later also, balance doesn't mean a 50% equal weight, right? Definitely US India relationship will be at a different level than India China relationship. And it's about getting what we want from the US rather than trying to strike this 50% or equidistant relationship, right? It won't be equidistant. It will likely be where US and India are doing a lot more and not with India China. The third one is, the interesting thing is, we do so little with China apart from like a buy-sell relationship, that there's enough space for us to do some things and yet continue what we are doing with the US, right? Just like still there is no direct flight between India and China, right? Like world's 33% of the world's population, there's no direct flight. So that can happen. In fact, Biden and Xi Jinping, there have been so many meetings, phone calls, etc. But very little of that happened between India and China for good reasons, because there was a border strife. But there is scope for a lot of things that can be done. For example, BYD had invested in US in 2018 also, right? That hasn't happened in India. So those kinds of things there is still a space for India to do something. And in the West, it might be seen as, oh, some strategic reset has happened between India and China, but that's not really the case. There's much scope for doing things tactically on the economic side, rather than thinking that India has fundamentally shifted its position. India is not a transactional power. I think Ambassador Vijay Gokhale had written. So that stays true. So it won't be like India is going to suddenly change positions from US to China or whatever. India will be on India's side. So the final point is, I think one learning for me is, see, admiration for other countries does not necessarily translate into good relationship between the two nations, right? So the others nation states can admire India, India can admire other nation states, but that is no guarantee of how the relationship between the states move on. That has its own logic, so we can't anthropomorphize a lot of these things. It depends on power equations, and that really determine how the things pan out. So those were my 4 points. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Pranay and Manoj for guiding us through this discussion. With that, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. A real pleasure to have you. And thank you once again to our two speakers.